Here's yet another video on intersectionality. This one is looking at critiques of intersectionality theory. Judith Butler, who interestingly often uses ideas of intersectionality in her work, and particularly looks at intersections between feminism and queer theory, argues that the logic of identity politics under her theoretical Foucauldian framework is problematic in that subjects are produced by discourses and by technologies of power rather than as groups, perhaps with individualised ideas. At the same time, she acknowledges that those discourses and technologies can produce groups who have unique experiences, such as women of colour, queer women, etc. According to Geertz and Van Thuen, who respond to this critique, intersectional theory before Butler, and Butler is quite strongly represented in intersectional theory, still appears to be fully embedded in this logic. Intersectional thinkers namely tend to treat subjects such as black women as being restricted by the hegemonic discourse. That is, that black women have certain characteristics which hegemonic discourses place upon them, rather than necessarily looking at the plethora of experience of women of colour, though they themselves claim to be able to see through it. That is, the theorists claim, oh, I can see the hegemonic discourse and I can see that people have individualised experiences, but at the same time there is this class of interests. Of course, however, theorists are not bound by this dualism, and Foucault's own concept, as Butler would later acknowledge, includes not only the discourse which produces the identity, but that every discourse creates its own possibilities of resistance. So that, for example, he was looking at queer identities in the mid-20th century, and he looked to some degree at how the idea of burying or closeting queer people then created its own class of resistance, which was, for example, a gay nightclub scene where people could come out of the closet and could fulfill a more flamboyant, bigoted idea of what they should be, but in ways which worked for them as a resistance group rather than being only imposed by the dominant group. And that those ideas and ways of resisting don't exist until people were shoved into the closet, such that coming out of the closet then became an act of resistance. And of course, another counter-argument to this argument is that the embodied subject is not merely a discourse. We all have our own embodied experience of the world, which is quite separate to what the world tells us we are. Another critique, Butler goes on to say that classes of intersectionality can eventually become so endless that you talk about different classes, etc., that etc. becomes itself a sign of exhaustion, as well as of the illimitable process of signification, of the idea of groups being constantly created anew. And for this, she's saying, so when you start to talk about black, queer, women, etc., that etc. is an admission that there will never be a closed class, that there will always be new signifiers and new ways of being. Knapp responds that Butler's talk of an illimitable process of signification can be reductionist if it's generalised in an unspecified way. An analytical perspective which in a critical or affirmative fashion concentrates exclusively on the symbolic modes of construction, that is of identity, and representation of difference as identity, runs the risk of levelling historically constituted factual difference, that is ways that people are allocated to particular social groupings, and thereby suppressing difference on its own terms. So acting as if there is so much difference that one cannot productively talk about the different experiences of groups is such that it can itself become oppressive. And Butler herself actually looks at the way that one can deploy a range of intersectional identities. So I think here she's acknowledging to some degree the issues with the idea of intersectionality while still using them. And Knapp is critiquing that this idea that we can always come up with more and new identities can be a cop-out, basically, in many ways. Another critique is that appropriate methods for applying intersectionality are unclear. Other forms of jurisprudence, for example, Roald Dawkins jurisprudence, have their own methodologies, whereas intersectional theory and intersectional critical race theory or intersectional feminism by itself does not come with a specific methodological basis, which in some areas of endeavour and some types of social science is seen as a flaw. The way that intersectionality is deployed depends very much on the context and method of the way the theory is being used or the type of study being done. And as a critical construct, of course, it's not limited to any particular methodology. Supporters of intersectional feminism would say this is actually one of its strengths. It is not prescriptive and in fact pushes us to look beyond prescriptive ideas which are imposed by traditional knowledges. Another critique is there's a tension between negative and positive deployments of identity. And this is actually something which is used for most types of identity-based theorising and politics. That yes, there are positive ideas in coming together as women to talk about feminism, but there are negative deployments of stereotypes of women that are used against women and against feminist women, etc. This, of course, is not particularly the response to that critique that there's, by identifying an identity, for example, black women, Asian women, disabled women. There's no reason that that intersectional identity cannot be used in multiple ways, both by oppressors who try to put stereotypes on that group and by that group themselves to fight back against stereotypes. The issue, of course, arises where people are oppressed using multiple categorizations, such that, for example, disabled women are presumed to be sexless, poor mothers, etc. To fight back against that, one must first identify where that discourse is coming from and then to be able to explain why it is false. There has also been a critique that the idea of intersectionality has been glommed onto by the ivory tower. It has drifted away from the practical application that Crenshaw talks about and the way it causes problems for people on the ground in court cases, etc., to being a more abstract theoretical construction. And that can, when we sit around just talking and twiddling our thumbs and talking about intersectional identities, forgetting that they have very real world effects, that is a valid critique of any theory, of course, that academics play with. And that the academy itself needs to be grounded in the real world rather than merely talking amongst itself. Another critique is that intersectionality is too bound up with notions of identity and identity formation, which leads to a lack of analysis of class and other group social organisation, leading to a neglect of underlying power issues. And again, that comes out of the way that some analysis is being done. Some people look at analysis of why people create and form identities of social groups. That, of course, does not mean that people can't deploy intersectional identities on the ground to look at power issues, etc. But it's a matter of focus rather than a matter fundamentally at being a flaw with the idea of intersectionality, in my view. Clearly, I'm a fan of intersectionality. And of course, for both of these issues, it's the use of the idea of intersectionality, not a boundary or a hard limit on the idea itself, which is leading to this critique. Other theorists do critique the idea that often the exemplar used in discussions of intersectionality is African American women. And this is critiqued in that it's very US-centric, of course. African American women have different experiences in their life to First Nations women in Australia, women of colour in other Western societies, or women of colour in where they're marked out as the other or different in any society. The critique is that this erases oppressions based on racism towards non-African American women. And this essentialism essentialises the experience of African American women at the same time as talking about how their experiences differ from that of other women. It then puts them back in a box where they're expected to have a homogenous set of experiences. And may ignore other axes of oppression experienced by both African American women and other people, such as class, non-binary gendering, being non-cisgendered, having oppressed religious backgrounds, disability, etc. Patricia Hill Collins responds to this as a woman and a theorist who writes from a black woman's perspective. And she says, a black woman's standpoint may provide a preferred stance from which to view the matrix of domination, because in principle, black feminist thought as specialised thought is less likely than the specialised knowledge produced by dominant groups to deny the correct connection between ideas and the vested interests of their creators. So she's talking there about how women of colour in the US, by being multiply oppressed, are less likely than, for example, white feminists or black male critical race theorists to overlook some axis of oppression and to disappear the experience of others. But at the same time, she also says no one group has a clear angle of vision. And this idea has led to what we call standpoint theory. Standpoint theory is a methodological process, often adopted by intersectional people. So putting lie to the idea that there isn't a methodology. It has grown up more recently than the original idea just of intersectionalism, where one tries to put oneself in the standpoint of a particular person or experience and work from that standpoint rather than assuming a single neutral standpoint. That single neutral, non-gendered, non-race standpoint tended for many, many years to be the standpoint of white privileged men, because that was considered neutral. But it too is, of course, a particular raced, gendered, abled or disabled, cisgendered or trans, etc. standpoint, the same as any other standpoint on any other axes. So she's acknowledging that, but then saying sometimes being at the bottom of the heap lets you see how big the heap is and how some of the people at the top see themselves as neutral when they're having a very different experience. Another response, of course, is that choices of focus by themselves don't limit intersectionality. That simply because one writer writes from the viewpoint of being a black woman in the US does not mean that other intersectional theorists can't write about their experience of being an Asian transgendered woman in Australia, for example. So there's a whole lot of other experiences that can be claimed and owned. It's just that a lot of the writers in the idea of intersectionality have been black women in the US. It also actually highlights another issue, more general delegitimization of women's and people of colour's experience that require women or people of colour to not only state their own experience, but also explain it and do extra emotional work to universalise their experience and to cater for the emotional reactions of people outside of their group, particularly more privileged people. So that to require African American women to explore all forms of intersectionality when discussing their own experiences is in itself a form of oppression and may simultaneously lead to them oppressing others, so that an abled black woman may not be able to properly explore the intersectional experience of a disabled woman. So a lot of these things are about this critique, I think, is because a lot of writers in the area have come from a particular viewpoint, but I think it's because yes, it can look like most intersectional writers are unpacking things from one particular viewpoint, but that is not a requirement of intersectionality. It is the fact that many people in the area share a set of experiences. Another is that intersectionality can position difference and social grouping as sources of discrimination, which might actually lead historical and current power dynamics between and within groups. And of course, for this itself, the issue is not to assume that the group is what hegemonic discourse says it is, but also to carefully consider methodologies and analyses which do not ignore those power groups and which do not essentialise group members. Again, this critique tends to be about how intersectionality is done rather than the concept of intersectionality itself, which, as you can see, is some of the critiques. A lot of the critiques of intersectional theory are about how it's done rather than the core ideas. So that's it for this one.